and thank you all for coming. It's late in the day, and you're probably all exhausted from sitting in front of people talking. So thank you for coming, and yeah, I appreciate it. So this talk is titled "Scaling the Security Researcher to Eliminate Open Source Security Vulnerabilities Once and for All." Just a little bit of an introduction. Who am I? My name is Jonathan Leitschuh. I am a software engineer, software security researcher. I'm the first ever Dan Kaminsky Fellow. I'm a GitHub star and a GitHub security ambassador, and you can find me on Twitter at jleitschuh. I'll put it up in the end of the slides too. So, so a little bit of a disclaimer. This does cover a SaaS tool, but it's available for free for open source and for use in your own security research. Also, I'm legally obligated to tell you that I'm sponsored by GitHub, so. You know, but again, all the stuff in this talk is open source, freely available to use. Yeah. This work is supported by the Dan Kaminsky Fellowship at Human Security. For those of you who don't know, Dan was best known for a vulnerability in DNS back in 2008, which he quietly fixed around the world privately and then disclosed at Black Hat and DEF CON in 2008. Dan was best known for his kindness and compassion in the security industry, and I sadly never got the opportunity to meet Dan. And the Dan Kaminsky Fellowship was created to commemorate and celebrate Dan's memory and legacy by funding open source work that helps make the world a better and more secure place. And so this is the work that I've been doing under the Dan Kaminsky Fellowship for the past year. So, spoilers. I generated a bunch of pull requests to fix a vulnerability called zip slip across the Java ecosystem. In particular, I generated 152 pull requests to fix zip slip across the Java ecosystem. But we'll get into, if you don't know what zip slip is, don't worry, we'll get there. Also, there's like a story for how we got here. So let's start at the beginning. This whole story started with a simple vulnerability. And this was that vulnerability. It was in my company's Gradle build, and it was the use of HTTP instead of HTTPS to resolve our dependencies without any additional authentication, because the Java ecosystem doesn't have additional verification of artifacts being downloaded in your build tool. And so this is why this is important, right? You know, classic attacker in the middle vulnerability, the use that can be result of using HTTP instead of HTTPS. And this is an example of that same vulnerability existing in Maven POM files. So Gradle, which is the first build tool file that I showed you, is used to build 50% of the Java ecosystem, and Maven is used to build the other 50% of the Java ecosystem. And Gradle is also used as the build tool for 99% of the Android ecosystem. So if you have an Android phone, the apps on your phone some way got there through the supply chain supplied by Gradle. This is what it looks like in artifact upload, and this is where credentials are also attached, so they're also sending credentials over the wire. And this vulnerability was everywhere. It existed in the organizations of Spring, the projects of Spring, Apache, Red Hat, Kotlin, JetBrains, Jenkins, Gradle, Groovy, Elasticsearch, Eclipse Foundation. And who else was vulnerable? Oracle, the NSA, LinkedIn, Stripe. This impacted open source projects of all of these different organizations. So I reached out to Maven Sonatype, and Maven Sonatype is the Python, pip to the Python ecosystem, NPM to the JavaScript ecosystem. Sonatype is that for the Java ecosystem. And they reported that 25% of their traffic in June of 2019 was still using HTTP to resolve dependencies instead of HTTPS. And so how do we fix this? Well, I pushed forward an initiative that on January 15th, 2020, all the major artifact servers in the Java ecosystem would decommission support for HTTP in favor of only supporting HTTPS. And I got support. The major artifact servers all published blog posts announcing it. I published tweets. We talked about it. Unfortunately, on January 2020, which was only 15 days away from decommissioning support for HTTP across the industry, Sonatype said that still 20% of the artifacts or of the industry was using HTTP to resolve dependencies instead of HTTPS. So you can imagine what might have happened on January 15th, 2020. Lots of broken software. Yeah, but we stopped the bleeding. But what about the other repositories? So these are only the most commonly used repositories in the Java ecosystem. The thing about the Java ecosystem is companies will host artifact servers, organizations will host artifact servers. So people are building their Java software from a variety of different sources, pulling their components in from a variety of different repositories. And so this only fixed the top 4. There's the rest of the industry and the rest of the open source ecosystem still vulnerable. So how do we fix the rest? And I said, let's just generate pull requests. Let's fix this vulnerability at scale and deal with the vulnerability at its source. And so how? Well, first you need to track down the vulnerable code. And so I wrote a CodeQL query to find this vulnerability. It's very simple. And for this so CodeQL scans 100,000 open source projects. And so you can write a CodeQL query and run it against open source projects across the industry and find vulnerabilities, just like this. And for this little bit of query, I submitted it to the GitHub Security Lab bug bounty program and got it merged into the main line so that any project that's using CodeQL to scan their projects are using this query now. And for this, GitHub awarded me a $2,300 bounty. I'm getting a bit of it. There we go. I have an echo back there. And then I wrote a pull request generator using the list of vulnerable projects. It was Python-based. It had a wrapper over GitHub's hub CLI, one nasty regular expression, and a lot of logic for bouncing off of GitHub's rate limiter. And this is the logic. This is the pull request engine. You can see the commit message, the branch. There's an underlying engine behind all of this logic, but this was the first thing that I wrote. And this is that regular expression that I talked to you about. And so this was for fixing it in XML files. And the reason that I used a regular expression instead of an XML parser is that if you parse XML into an XML parser, and then you modify that XML, and then you dump it back out, the XML parser is going to dump it back out into its format, not the format of the source code that you originally imported. And so the only way to fix vulnerabilities and not have a giant diff that the maintainer is going to see and be like, great, thanks for fixing a vulnerability. I'm not merging that, though, because it changes everything else in the file. You need to use regular expressions. The problem is, if you use regular expressions to solve your problem, now you have 2 problems. But it worked, regardless. I generated pull requests. In fact, and this is an example of the diff, right? Just a simple replacement, HTTP to HTTPS, in the right locations in these POM files. And I generated 1,596 pull requests to fix this vulnerability across the Java ecosystem. And this was in 2020, as of 2022, today, there's about a 40% merge rate on that, which is a solid number of projects that have been fixed as a result of this. And for this additional work, GitHub awarded me an additional $4,000 bounty for this work and fixing this vulnerability across GitHub under the GitHub Security Lab bug bounty program. And so I got hooked on this idea of bulk pull request generation. This is my GitHub contribution graph for 2020. You can see I actually did 2 campaigns for different vulnerabilities in 2020. I have a problem. I have ADHD. That's not my problem. I don't think that ADHD is a problem. The problem is that I love chasing squirrels. And I will go and read vulnerability disclosure feeds, and I'll be like, I wonder where else that vulnerability is. And the thing is, I will find that same vulnerability in a lot of places, using CodeQL, using the GitHub security, GitHub search. I'm finding too many security vulnerabilities. This is an example of a CodeQL query result for zip-slip. I didn't write the query, but you can look at this. This is on lgtm.com, and there are pages and pages and pages and pages of this result coming back with positive indications of this vulnerability existing in open source software. This is a critical security vulnerability in a lot of cases. And so if I'm finding too many security vulnerabilities, I need a solution. I need automation. So this is where automated accurate transformation at massive scale comes in. I need a solution that allows for automated accurate transformations. And this is where OpenRewrite comes in. OpenRewrite is an open source library available on GitHub, and it lets us write recipes to fix vulnerabilities at scale. And the unlock that OpenRewrite provides, so abstract syntax trees. Abstract syntax trees represent the source code that you're looking at. So when you're running a compiler, like the Java compiler, the C compiler, they transform that source code into an abstract syntax tree. The problem is that if you were to dump this abstract syntax tree back out into source code, you'd get all the white space gone, all the tabs, all the comments are missing, because the compiler doesn't care about that stuff. And so what OpenRewrite allows and what OpenRewrite unlocks is that it lets you preserve those white space tabs and stuff like that. And so you can transform back and forth between the AST that OpenRewrite has into the source code that was originally the source. This is the problem that I was trying to solve with that regular expression earlier. And also, there's a templating engine that allows you to generate new code that looks like the surrounding source code. So if that project uses tabs or uses spaces or uses braces on a new line, it can generate new code that looks like that surrounding code. So the maintainer is not going to be like, hey, great, thank you for changing this, but it doesn't look like my formatting. I'm not going to merge this. And also, it's fully type attributed. Is this log4j, SLF4j, logback? Those are all logging frameworks in the Java ecosystem. The type attribution lets you know what type that is. I can't imagine this ever being relevant, potentially, if there was a big security vulnerability in a logging framework, ever, log4j. And also, with the type attribution and formatting, you end up with this really rich graph of data that you can work on. There's actually 6,000 nodes missing from this graph on the left because otherwise it would just be fuzz. And if you need to generate new code, sometimes it generates, you have really complex ASTs. So if you need to insert new source code into the AST to fix the vulnerability, it can be really complicated. And so what if I need to inject this new bit of code to fix zip slip? And again, we'll get into zip slip and what it is for those of you who don't know. But let's assume we need to inject this code to fix a vulnerability. How do we do that? Well, OpenRewrite comes with a templating engine that lets you provide variables and a template and say, I need to inject this code, generate for me the AST, the Java types required to represent this source code. And it also comes with a coordinate system that lets you place that source code exactly in the right location in the file or in the tree to fix the vulnerability. And so we can go from this vulnerable code to this fixed version of the code very easily. So what's possible now? What vulnerabilities can we fix given the unlock that OpenRewrite provides? I'm going to talk to you about 3 different vulnerabilities: temporary directory hijacking, partial path traversal, and zip slip, and the research that I engaged in using OpenRewrite to fix these vulnerabilities at scale. So vulnerability number 1, temporary directory hijacking. For those of you who don't know, the temporary directory on Unix-like systems is shared between all users. So if you write contents of file contents into that directory, other local users will be able to view those files. And this is temporary directory hijacking. And the vulnerability exists because, well, this bit of code you'll see a lot, because prior to Java 1.7, there did not exist an API to create a temporary directory. So people would create a temporary file, which does create a file with a randomly named, pseudo-random number, CSPRNG, like secure random number generator, and then they'd call delete on it, and then they'd call makedir. And this is because there wasn't an API to create directories directly. And so you'd actually get this vulnerability if you looked on Stack Overflow to say, how do I create a temporary directory? So why is this vulnerable? It's vulnerable because there's a race condition here. And the race condition exists between the delete and the makedir. An attacker can view the content, the file being created, see that it gets deleted, and then race the Java process to create the directory before the Java process does. And if they do, they own the directory. And this directory returns false. This makedir returns false if it fails. So if you're not checking the return code, you're vulnerable. It doesn't throw an exception if makedir fails. This is one valid fix for this vulnerability. However, it's still insufficient because when you use makedir, it'll use the default uname permissions for the file that's being created, And so this directory that's been created will still be visible to the contents of the directory will still be visible to other users. And so you're still exposing the contents. And so this is what's called temporary directory information disclosure. And so this is the real fix. You switch to this new API that was introduced in Java 1.7. We're currently on Java 17. So this API has been around for a while. You can safely use it. And this will fix the vulnerability by setting the correct POSIX permissions on the directory that's being created. And I got a bunch of CVEs for this vulnerability. I generated pull requests. In this case, I generated 64 pull requests across the open source ecosystem to fix this vulnerability across open source. And this is an example. You can see the removal of the delete and the make dir. But we can also do more complicated things. If we need to remove those, we need to remove those if checks, because even though this is not vulnerable to temporary directory hijacking, it's still vulnerable to temporary directory information disclosure. So we still want to fix this vulnerability and clean it up. And so you can see that OpenRewrite is able to generate this diff using the abstract syntax tree transformer OpenRewrite. And so vulnerability number 2 that I want to talk to you about is a vulnerability called partial path traversal. Partial path traversal, let's assume that you have 2 local users on a system. You have user Sam and user Samantha. And you have logic that you want to sandbox your file access to user Sam. Partial path traversal allows an attacker to access a sibling directory with the same prefix. So again, starting with user Sam, if you have user Samantha, the vulnerability exists because you haven't correctly sandboxed your logic, and it allows an attacker to access user Samantha because they share a common prefix. And this is the vulnerable code. But let's dive into why this is vulnerable in particular. So get canonical path is actually the reason this is vulnerable. And let's dive into why. Get canonical path is used to normalize a file. So it gets rid of the path traversals, right? It normalizes the file out. So the problem with get canonical path, though, is even though it does correctly normalize the file, when it returns a string, and that string that gets returned when you call it in user /spam, it returns a string like this. And you notice there's a missing trailing slash on that string. And so if you're using this starts with call, it allows the vulnerability. So let's take this input as an example. Let's say that we've sandboxed our logic to user Sam, and we have a user-controlled value coming in, /Samantha/Baz. When get canonical path gets called on that, user/Samantha/Baz does start with user/Sam, and this IO exception does not get thrown, and the guard that was in place gets bypassed. And so what's the fix for partial path traversal? So one of the fixes is to re-add that path separator value back into the starts with call. The better fix, though, is to use the Java 1.7 introduced API path and do a starts with comparison on it. And that will do the correct comparisons. Yes. So how do we find this vulnerability? Well, if you're looking at this code, we need to identify the vulnerability in order to fix it with OpenRewrite. So how do we do that? So first thing we're looking for in the abstract syntax tree is a starts with call on the string object, the Java string object. And then we're looking for a subject, get canonical path, and also an argument, which is get canonical path. And we want to also look for cases where we have this path separator character present, because we don't want to fix source code that's not vulnerable, right? This is not vulnerable. We don't want to fix it, right? So we need to differentiate that, because we don't want to be generating pull requests where it's not necessary to fix this vulnerability. So it can't just be that easy, right? Well, developers write code in a lot of different ways. So what if a developer pulls that value into a variable? Or they pull the argument into a variable? Or they have the fix, but it's also in a variable? How do we know if this logic is vulnerable or not when looking at it from the abstract syntax tree? And so we need data flow analysis. Data flow analysis allows us to track the value as it flows through the application and determine this starts with is being called on the return value of get canonical path. And it also lets us determine that the argument is flowing to this argument in this function. But it also can do intermediate steps through the application as well and track that. So data flow allows us to uncover hard to find vulnerabilities and prevents false positives. And this is the data flow analysis API. How many of you have written any CodeQL? Hey, yeah, we actually got some responses. So if you've used CodeQL's data flow analysis API, this is very similar. I wrote it intentionally to make my life sane and your life sane. So you can translate your knowledge from data flow analysis for CodeQL to OpenRewrite very easily. And this is the fix, right? This is an example of actually generating the fix to fix this vulnerability. You can see we clean up the code and we put the correct call in place. There's an example of this vulnerability. It was in the AWS Java SDK. This is a funny story, I promise you. This vulnerability existed in this little bit of logic that attempted to sandbox as you're downloading the contents of an AWS S3 bucket to verify that the keys of that AWS S3 bucket are not path traversal payloads attempting to escape the destination directory when you're downloading the contents of the S3 bucket. And so they were using this logic, this method called leaves root, and you can see that vulnerability where that starts with call is that leaves us to be vulnerable. And they were using it in this guard here that says cannot download key as relative path resolves outside the parent directory. So it was vulnerable. I reported it to the AWS team, and there was a little bit of vulnerability disclosure drama, as with any good story. The AWS security team said to me, hey, thank you for reporting this vulnerability. We'd like to award you a bug bounty. However, we need you to sign an NDA. And I said, I don't normally agree to NDAs. Can I read it first before agreeing? And they said, we are unable to share the bug bounty program NDA since it and other contract documents are considered sensitive by the legal team. Anybody play Pokemon? Yeah. So, there's drama there. I don't have the time to tell the rest. Anyways, they haven't paid me yet. That's the summary. All right, so vulnerability number 3, zip slip. Zip slip is a path traversal vulnerability while unpacking zip files, file entries. And this is zip slip. The reason that zip slip is so a zip file is a key value pair with the file path to the contents of the file that's getting unpacked. Now, if an attacker controls that zip file, they can craft a zip file that has a path traversal payload in the key, and then that contents, if the unzip logic is vulnerable, will unpack outside of the intended destination directory. And so this is vulnerable because getName is that key, and the output stream is being created with that file, and the contents of that file are flowing to that output stream. And so this can lead to remote code execution in certain cases, if you're able to overwrite the correct directory or write contents to the correct location on the file system. Zip slip is complicated. Zip slip is complicated because this is a valid fix for zip slip. And again, we're looking not just to fix it ourselves, but also looking at source ASTs and saying, is this code vulnerable? Do I need to fix it, right? So this is a valid fix. But the problem with zip slip is that while this is a valid fix, so is this, right? And developers write code in a lot of different ways. So how do we determine if we're looking at this bit of logic or this bit of logic guarding this unpack logic? And so we need control flow analysis. Control flow analysis lets us differentiate between these two bits of code. And the way that we do that is by generating a graph that represents the flow of the code. And the graph is made up of basic blocks, which are the set of contiguous operations that are going to occur in a program without jumps. And then there are condition nodes, like if checks, where the logic in a program will branch. And by representing the code in this way with control flow analysis, we can analyze this graph and determine if the vulnerable logic will be reachable or not, or if there's a guard in place preventing that vulnerability from being present. And so we can look at this non-vulnerable code and see that when we present the control flow analysis graph for that code, we can see that there is a valid guard in place. f.toPath starts with destination toPath that prevents this vulnerability from existing, so we don't need to fix it. And so when we put all this together, we can actually generate pull requests and generate diffs to fix this vulnerability. And this is, a more complicated, we're even cleaning up the surrounding code a little bit to fix this vulnerability. So let's talk about pull request generation. Got security vulnerabilities? Everybody can get a pull request. So there's some problems with pull request generation. One of the questions you might ask is, how fast can you generate pull requests on something like GitHub? So for when you're generating a pull request, or even if you're creating a pull request as a developer, there are a bunch of steps you need to make. Some of them are file I/O, Git operations, GitHub API calls. GitHub API calls are rate limited. So the first thing you need to do is check out and download the source code repository, which is a Git operation. It's free on GitHub, not rate limited at all. Then you need to branch, apply the diff, and commit the changes. Fork the repository on GitHub. Rename the repository on GitHub. And this is important because if you're forking hundreds or thousands of repositories, which I have done, you're going to end up with name conflicts. And so you need to rename the repository every single time to avoid those name conflicts. Otherwise, GitHub says you can't do that. Then you need to push the changes. And then you need to create the pull request on GitHub. And you notice that 3 of these are API calls to GitHub. And GitHub asks that you wait at least 1 second per API call that makes a write or a modification to their system. And then they also have a secondary and tertiary rate limit. The secondary rate limit is a response with a header that says wait at least this amount of time before doing another operation. And the third one is just slow down, you've gone too fast. And the latter one doesn't really have a defined when to wait to. So GitHub, if you could stop rate limiting your API so aggressively, it would make my life a lot easier. Yeah. So we made it this far. We've detected the vulnerability. We've detected the style. And we fixed the code and generated the diff in the style that looks like the surrounding source code. And we've bypassed the rate limit by basically slowing down enough to whatever that means to make GitHub happy. How do we actually fix this for all the repositories on GitHub that we want? So this is where we're going to introduce Moderne. Moderne is free for open source projects. They have about 7,000 repositories indexed across the Java ecosystem. And it allows you to rewrite transformations at scale and generate and update any pull requests that you may create using it. And this is the SaaS that they have. They have recipes for things like transforming your code from, updating the version of Spring, for example. We all, as security practitioners, know how important it is to keep a dependency like Spring up to date. But also, you might not think about your testing framework and your organization as a security critical. But if you want to run the latest version of Spring in your Java application, you have to update your test framework to use JUnit 5, because the latest version of Spring will only run its tests on the latest version of JUnit. And the problem is, between JUnit 4 and JUnit 5, there were a lot of API breaking changes. It requires a lot of work to rewrite your source code, your tests, to use this new version of JUnit. And so there's a migration for that. You may not think of your tests as security critical, but turns out, if you can't update a dependency, sometimes it is. And then it also supports bulk pull request generation across your open source repository, across your corporate repository as well, inside of, yeah. And so if I want to generate pull requests, this is, for example, temporary directory hijacking. You can say I want to create a pull request from a fork. You can set the branch name, the commit name, the organization you're going to create the fork from, set the pull request title, the pull request body, add your GPG keys, yes, into a SaaS, I know. But then, it'll just go and generate the pull request for you, on your behalf, and it'll look like it's coming from your account. And so that's what I did. So The problem is, though, I told you earlier, Moderne is indexing 7,000 open source projects, but there are more than 7,000 open source Java projects in the world. How do we find the other vulnerable projects? And this is where CodeQL comes in. CodeQL scans hundreds of thousands of open source projects and over 35,000 open source Java projects. And so you can write a CodeQL query to find vulnerabilities at scale and get a list of projects that you know to be vulnerable, and then make a pull request to add that list of projects that are vulnerable to this list here, which is open source. It's a CSV file. And then Moderne will begin to ingest those open source repositories as well, so that you can run your open source, your open rewrite recipe across those projects as well. So finally, let's go generate some open source pull requests. That's what I did. This is some, it's flashy, not really, but and so let's look at the statistics. For temporary directory hijacking, I generated 64 pull requests, partial path traversal, 50 pull requests, and zip slip, 152 pull requests. Think about how much time it would take to report each one of these vulnerabilities by hand to a project and wait for its standard 90-day disclosure timeline. It's a lot of time saved. So new pull requests that I've generated this year alone, over 600. And I've personally been involved in generating over 5,200 pull requests to my name. One unlucky project was the recipient of all 3 of the vulnerability fixes that I generated this year. Yes. And this is my contribution graph for this year. I've continued refining the recipes and generating more pull requests and refining the recipes and getting more projects indexed. Yeah. So with the time that I have left, I want to discuss some of the best practices for bulk pull request generation. Messaging. You are dealing with real people when you're doing this. There's this saying, all software problems are people problems in disguise. And I have just thrown a software solution at a people problem. These are vulnerabilities in real software with real maintainers who are owning this code. So you do need to consider the human element around the vulnerabilities that you're disclosing in this way. I include in my disclosures the vulnerability details like what the impact is, how I fixed it, why this fixes it, but also how to opt out, potentially, if you don't want to receive more of these things. And then some simpler lessons. Lesson 1, sign off on all your commits. This is what a sign off looks like inside of a commit message. And why would you want to do this? Well, there's a bunch of lawsuits in open source a few years ago, TLDR lawyers. Otherwise, you'll get your pull requests rejected by evil dragon bureaucrats. Lesson number 2, be a good commitizen, GPG sign your commits. That's where you get the verified logo in the bottom in the corner. Or you'll end up like Linus Torvalds, who's been impersonated on GitHub multiple times. So yeah. Git is insecure by default, not Linus. Yeah. Anyways, CCOM. It's a commit format for your commits that are fixing security vulnerabilities. So if you want to put in your commit message a standardized format for the vulnerabilities you're fixing, go look at CCOM. I don't have the time to dive into it right now, but that's something to look into. Lesson 4, there are risks to using your personal GitHub account. Has anybody here, by a show of hands, familiar with GitHub's angry unicorn? The one that, like, when GitHub crashes, you get that error? Yeah, I'm getting some nods. Yeah, okay. This is the angry unicorn. This is my GitHub profile for most of 2020. I broke my GitHub account doing this. So while I do recommend, there is this risk, I do actually recommend using your personal GitHub account. And the reason that I recommend using your personal GitHub account is because it looks like it's coming from a real person instead of an organization or a bot. And the maintainer is more likely to interact with you on a personal level and feel less threatened if it's not coming from a bot account, if it's coming from a real person with positive intentions. And then also, when they respond to those things, I can respond back and say, no, 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 I am a real person. This fixes the vulnerability. And then if they merge it, I can say, hey, do you need assistance with vulnerability disclosure? Do you need a CVE? I can put you in touch with SNCC. I can do it. You can do it. How do you want to get how do you want to get this information out to your maintainers or to your users? Lesson 5, coordinate with GitHub. I reached out to GitHub before I did this and let them know that I was doing this. This is the GitHub Security Lab email address. Reach out to them and let them know you're going to do this so you don't get banned. Also, so that they know what you're doing and can run air support for you. And then consider the implications. Shortly after I began this campaign, I got this issue opened against my security research GitHub account. GitHub repository. Leitschuh / security-research. Is this responsible disclosure? And I use the more nuanced term coordinated disclosure, but regardless of what you call it, the answer is no. This is full disclosure of a security vulnerability in an open source project that does not have a patch. You're ODing a maintainer, a project, an ecosystem. And so you need to consider the implications of that. However, the alternative in many cases is no disclosure at all. Because I don't have the time to go to every single small project to report these vulnerabilities individually. There's just not enough time in a day. And so I've made this decision because I believe that the risks outweigh the potential rewards. Fixed vulnerabilities in open source software. So in conclusion, as security researchers, I believe we have an obligation to society. We know these vulnerabilities are out there. We've written them up in pen test reports. We've been on the receiving end of them. We've seen them in source code that we've audited. We know that they're out there. We understand how they work. I'm going to give you a hint. Most software developers don't watch Black Hat talks, don't watch DEF CON talks. Some of them do. A lot of them do not. So we know how these vulnerabilities work. And I believe we have an obligation to the society out there to use our knowledge of math science technology to fix these vulnerabilities at scale. There's the statistic that GitHub has. For every 500 developers, you have one security researcher. We are heavily outnumbered in this industry. And so I believe that bulk pull request generation is one of the best ways for us to scale our knowledge of security to fix these vulnerabilities that plague the industry writ large. And with that, I want to leave you with one final quote. It's from Dan Kaminsky. It's on his Twitter profile. It's there to this day. We can fix it. We have the technology. Okay, we need to create the technology. All right, the policy guys are mucking with the technology. Relax. We're on it. So, some final notes. Learn CodeQL. It's really powerful. You can find vulnerabilities at scale. Contribute to OpenRewrite. Join the GitHub Security Lab and OpenRewrite Slack channels. They're both open. And then also, if you're interested in open source security at large across the industry, there's the Open Source Security Foundation, which is a part of the Linux Foundation. And they're having open meetings. There's an open calendar. You can join their meetings to discuss open source security vulnerabilities and open source at large securing it just by joining their meetings. And with that, I want to thank Human, my sponsor, Moderne, for working with me on this project. They've been awesome. Lydia Giuliano, the Black Hat speaker coach that I work with, and Sham, my intern, who created some of the graphics for control flow that you saw earlier. Thank you.